On September 13th, 1995, the Saudi Minister of Petroleum, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, stood before a gathering of OPEC ministers in Vienna and made an announcement that would echo through the halls of the Kremlin like a death sentence. Saudi Arabia, he declared, was tired of shouldering the burden of production cuts to maintain high oil prices. The kingdom would no longer act as OPEC's swing producer. From now on, Saudi Arabia would fight for market share. The other ministers in the room understood immediately what this meant. The Saudis were about to open the floodgates. They were about to drown the world in oil. Within weeks, Saudi production surged. Tankers laden with crude left the ports of Ras Tanura and Juaima in numbers not seen in years. The global oil market, which had been carefully balanced, was suddenly overwhelmed with supply. The price began to fall. It fell from $30 a barrel to $25, then to $20, then to $15. By early 1986, oil was trading at $10 a barrel, the lowest price in real terms since before the 1973 oil crisis. For most of the world, cheap oil was a blessing. For the Soviet Union, it was an execution, because by 1995, the Soviet economy was not running on communist ideology or 5-year plans. It was running on a single fragile commodity, oil, and the price collapse engineered by Saudi Arabia, and quietly, encouraged by the United States, would do what decades of Cold War confrontation could not. It would bring the Soviet Union to its knees. To understand how a price drop in the oil market could destroy a superpower, you have to understand the economic structure of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. The Soviet economy was, by this point, a fossil. It was a command economy designed in the 1920s and 1930s, rigid and inefficient, unable to adapt to the modern world. Soviet factories were antiquated. Soviet agriculture was a disaster, unable to feed its own population without importing grain from the West. Soviet consumer goods were shoddy and scarce. The shops were empty. The people were cynical and demoralized. The system was rotting from the inside. But there was one thing the Soviets had in abundance: oil. In the 1960s and 1970s, Soviet geologists discovered massive oil fields in western Siberia, particularly the Samotlar field, one of the largest oil deposits in the world. The Soviets invested heavily in extracting this oil. They built pipelines across thousands of miles of frozen tundra. They drilled in conditions that would have bankrupted private companies. But they succeeded. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union had become the world's largest oil producer, pumping over 12 million barrels per day. And crucially, they were exporting a significant portion of that oil to the West in exchange for hard currency. This was the lifeline. The Soviets could not produce the things their people needed. They could not make quality machinery, electronics, or consumer goods. But they could drill oil and sell it for dollars. Those dollars bought grain from America and Canada to feed the population. They bought technology from Europe and Japan. They bought the silence of the satellite states in Eastern Europe, which were subsidized with cheap Soviet oil. As long as the oil money flowed, the system could limp along. The Politburo in Moscow understood this dependency, but they believed the party would last forever. After all, the world needed oil, and the price had been high for over a decade. The 1970s had been kind to the Soviets. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 and the Iranian Revolution of 1959 had sent oil prices soaring. At its peak, oil was trading at nearly $40 a barrel. The Soviets were raking in billions of dollars in hard currency. They used this windfall to fund a massive military buildup. They invaded Afghanistan in 1979. They supported communist insurgencies in Africa, Central America, and Asia. They built a navy to challenge American dominance of the seas. They developed new generations of nuclear missiles. The Soviet leadership, particularly under Leonid Brezhnev, believed they were winning the Cold War. The correlation of forces, as they called it in Marxist jargon, was shifting in their favor. But they were building on sand. The entire Soviet revival of the 1970s was financed by a commodity whose price they did not control. In Washington, a new administration took power in 1981 that understood this vulnerability better than any before it. Ronald Reagan and his team of cold warriors looked at the Soviet Union and saw not an invincible adversary, but a brittle, overextended empire held together by oil revenue and military force. Reagan's CIA director, William Casey, was an old intelligence hand who had served in the OSS during World War II. Casey was obsessed with finding ways to put pressure on the Soviets without triggering a nuclear war. He ordered his analysts to study the Soviet economy in detail. The reports that came back were eye-opening. The CIA estimated that oil and gas exports accounted for as much as 80% of Soviet hard currency earnings. The Soviet economy was essentially a petro-state, more dependent on oil than Saudi Arabia itself. If the price of oil fell, the Soviets would face a fiscal catastrophe. They would be unable to import the grain they needed. They would be unable to subsidize Eastern Europe. They would be unable to maintain their military spending. Casey realized he had found the Achilles heel. But the United States could not lower the price of oil by itself. America was a net importer, not an exporter. To crash the oil market, The Americans needed a partner with enough production capacity to flood the market. They needed Saudi Arabia. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia in the 1980s was complex. The Saudis were conservative, deeply religious, and suspicious of Western cultural influence. But they were also pragmatic. They relied on American military protection. The Saudi royal family lived in constant fear of internal subversion and external threats from revolutionary Iran and Soviet-backed regimes. They needed America, and America needed Saudi oil to remain stable and affordable. The Reagan administration, through quiet diplomatic channels, began to make the case to the Saudis that their interests aligned in a very specific way. The argument was strategic. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in 1979, putting Soviet troops within striking distance of the Persian Gulf. Soviet influence was spreading in the Middle East through proxies like Syria and South Yemen. If the Soviets continued to expand, they could threaten the Gulf monarchies, including Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were already funding the Afghan Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters resisting the Soviet occupation. But the Americans proposed a more devastating weapon: economic warfare. If the Saudis increased production and drove down the price of oil, they would cripple the Soviet economy. The Soviets would be forced to cut military spending. They would lose the ability to project power. They might even collapse. The Americans made their pitch through various channels, including CIA officials, diplomats, and back-channel communications through intermediaries. The exact details of these discussions remain partly classified, but the outcome is clear. The Saudis agreed. There were risks for Saudi Arabia. Flooding the market with oil would drive down prices, which would hurt their own revenue in the short term. The Saudis were rich, but they also had budgets to balance and a population to keep happy. However, the Saudi calculation was that they had deep financial reserves, the lowest production costs in the world, and could outlast their competitors. More importantly, they saw the Soviet Union as an existential threat. The Soviets were atheist communists who had invaded a Muslim country, Afghanistan. Destroying Soviet power was a religious duty, as much as a strategic one. The timing was also opportune. By the mid-1980s, there was growing frustration within OPEC. Other member countries were cheating on their production quotas, producing more than they were supposed to, while the Saudis cut their output to keep prices high. The Saudis were tired of being the ones who sacrificed. So when they announced in 1985 that they were abandoning the role of swing producer and would compete for market share, it was presented as a response to OPEC indiscipline. But the real target was not OPEC, it was Moscow. The Saudis turned on the taps. Production surged from about 2 million barrels per day in early 1985 to over 5 million barrels per day by mid-1986. Other producers tried to keep up, but the Saudis had the capacity and the reserves to sustain this strategy. The global oil market went into freefall. The price collapsed. And in Moscow, the alarms began to sound. Mikhail Gorbachev had just come to power in March 1985. He was young by Soviet standards, energetic, and aware that the system was broken. He had launched a program of reforms called perestroika, meaning restructuring to modernize the Soviet economy. But his reforms were based on an assumption that the oil money would continue to flow. Gorbachev's economic planners had built their budgets, assuming oil would remain at around $30 a barrel. When the price collapsed to $10, those budgets were shredded. The Soviet Ministry of Finance watched in horror as their hard currency revenues evaporated. In 1985, the Soviets had earned approximately $30 billion from oil and gas exports. By 1986, that figure had been cut in half, and it kept falling. The impact was immediate and devastating. The Soviet Union depended on imported grain to feed its population because Soviet agriculture was chronically inefficient. When the hard currency dried up, the grain imports became unaffordable. Bread lines grew longer. Rationing was reintroduced in some areas. The Soviet government had to dip into its gold reserves to pay for food. They began selling gold on the international market, tons of it, just to buy wheat. But the gold reserves were finite. The military budget, which consumed around 20% of Soviet GDP, became unsustainable. Gorbachev was forced to make cuts. He reduced orders for new tanks and aircraft. He slowed the development of weapon systems. He began to withdraw Soviet troops from Afghanistan, not because the war was won, but because the war was unaffordable. The subsidies to Eastern European satellite states, which had kept regimes in Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia afloat, were slashed. The Soviets told their allies they were on their own. This was the beginning of the end, but the crisis went deeper than budgets. The Soviet leadership began to lose confidence. They realized they were trapped in a game they could not win. The fundamental problem was that the Soviet economy did not produce anything the world wanted to buy except raw materials. And now, the price of those raw materials was being manipulated by their enemies. The Soviets could not compete with the West in technology, manufacturing, or services. They had bet everything on oil. And the Americans and Saudis had pulled the rug out from under them. Gorbachev tried to respond with reforms, but the reforms only made things worse. He introduced glasnost, openness, allowing more freedom of speech and press. The idea was to invigorate society and expose corruption. Instead, it unleashed a flood of criticism that delegitimized the Communist Party. People began to openly question whether the system was worth saving. He tried to decentralize the economy, giving more autonomy to enterprises and introducing elements of market mechanisms. But this disrupted the command economy without replacing it with a functioning market. The result was chaos. Shortages worsened. The official economy began to disintegrate. By 1989, the Soviet Union was in a full-blown economic crisis. The government was running massive deficits, printing rubles to cover expenses, which led to inflation. The stores were empty. The people were angry. And critically, the Soviet republics began to assert their independence. The Baltic states, Ukraine, and others saw that the center was weak and started to demand autonomy or outright independence. The great irony is that Gorbachev was trying to save the Soviet Union. He believed that with reform, the system could be modernized and preserved, but the loss of oil revenue had already sealed its fate. The empire could not function without the money to hold it together, and when the money disappeared, the empire collapsed. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union, unable to afford the cost of maintaining its empire in Eastern Europe, did nothing. The satellite states broke free one by one. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War was over. The Americans had won, and the weapon that delivered the final blow was not a missile or a bomb. It was the price of oil. The role of the United States and Saudi Arabia in this collapse cannot be overstated. The oil price war was not a natural market event. It was a coordinated strategy. American officials have acknowledged in memoirs and declassified documents that there were discussions with the Saudis about using oil as a weapon against the Soviets. Some historians argue about the extent of formal coordination, but the outcome speaks for itself. The Saudis increased production dramatically, just as the Soviets were most vulnerable. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and the Americans benefited immensely. Not only did they weaken their superpower rival, but they also enjoyed a period of cheap oil that stimulated the American economy. The 1980s boom in the United States was fueled in part by low energy prices. It was a win-win for Washington. For Riyadh, the short-term pain of lower revenues was worth it. The Saudis outlasted their competitors. Many high-cost oil producers, including some American shale operations and offshore projects, were driven out of business by the low prices. When the price eventually recovered, the Saudis had a larger market share and more influence over OPEC. They had proven that they were willing and able to use oil as a strategic weapon. This established a precedent that would shape global oil markets for decades. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia was cemented. The two countries had worked together to destroy a common enemy. This cooperation would continue in other arenas, from the Gulf War in 1991 to counterterrorism efforts after 9/11, despite the complications and contradictions in that relationship. The Saudis had proven themselves to be a reliable ally in American strategic calculations, but the consequences of the oil price collapse extended far beyond the death of the Soviet Union. The collapse of oil prices in the 1980s created economic hardship in many oil-producing countries. Venezuela, Nigeria, Mexico, and others faced severe fiscal crises. These crises led to political instability, coup, and in some cases, the rise of authoritarian regimes. The ripple effects of the Saudi-American oil strategy were felt around the world. In Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, the memory of this economic defeat shaped a generation of leaders. Vladimir Putin, who was a KGB officer in East Germany when the Berlin Wall fell, watched the Soviet collapse with bitterness. He has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. When Putin came to power, one of his primary goals was to ensure that Russia would never again be so vulnerable. He sought to rebuild Russia's economy, diversify away from dependence on oil, and accumulate massive foreign currency reserves as a buffer. But he also learned the lesson of the 1980s. Oil is both a weapon and a vulnerability. This understanding has shaped Russia's foreign policy ever since. Russia has used its oil and gas exports as leverage over Europe, cutting supplies to Ukraine and other countries during disputes. Russia has also sought to manipulate oil prices through cooperation with OPEC and other producers. The oil wars of the 1980s never really ended. They just changed form. The strategy of using oil prices as a weapon has been employed repeatedly since. During the Gulf War in 1991, the Saudis increased production to offset the loss of Iraqi and Kuwaiti oil, stabilizing prices and preventing Saddam Hussein from benefiting from the crisis. In the 2000s, there were suspicions that Saudi production policies were influenced by American requests to keep prices stable during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. More recently, the shale oil boom in the United States changed the dynamics. America became a major oil producer again, reducing its dependence on Middle Eastern oil. In 2014, when oil prices collapsed again, some analysts argued that the Saudis were deliberately keeping production high to drive American shale producers out of business. Others suggested it was aimed at pressuring Russia and Iran, both of which were under Western sanctions and needed high oil prices to balance their budgets. The lesson of the 1980s is clear. Oil is not just a commodity. It is a strategic weapon. Nations that depend on oil exports are vulnerable to price manipulation. And nations that can control oil prices have enormous geopolitical power. The United States learned this lesson and has used it repeatedly. The Saudis learned this lesson and have alternated between cooperation and competition with other producers. The Soviets learned this lesson, but learned it too late. The tragedy of the Soviet Union is that they allowed themselves to become a petro-state. They had scientists, engineers, and a literate population. They had resources and industrial capacity, but they failed to build a diversified, dynamic economy. They became addicted to easy oil money. And when that money was taken away, they had nothing to fall back on. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not caused solely by the oil price collapse. There were many factors: internal contradictions of the communist system, the arms race with the United States, the failure of central planning, the rise of nationalist movements, and the mistakes of Soviet leadership. But the oil price war was the catalyst. It accelerated the collapse. It exposed the fundamental weakness of the system. It turned a slow decline into a rapid disintegration. Without the loss of oil revenue, the Soviet Union might have survived longer. It might have reformed gradually, as China did. But the financial hemorrhage caused by cheap oil made reform impossible. There was no money to cushion the transition. There was no room for experimentation. The system went into shock and never recovered. The story of how Saudi Arabia and America bankrupted the Soviet Union is a reminder that in the modern world, economic power is often more decisive than military power. The Soviet Union had tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, the largest army in the world, and a vast intelligence apparatus. But none of that mattered when they could not pay their bills. The Cold War was ultimately a contest of economic systems. The capitalist West, for all its flaws, proved more adaptable, more innovative, and more resilient than the communist East. And when the West decided to weaponize the one thing the Soviets depended on, oil, the outcome was inevitable. The oil price collapse of the 1980s is also a cautionary tale for any nation that becomes overly dependent on a single commodity. It does not matter whether that commodity is oil, gas, copper, or any other resource. If your economy is built on exporting one thing, you are vulnerable. Your fate is in the hands of the market, and the market can be manipulated. Diversification is not just an economic strategy. It is a survival strategy. The Soviet Union forgot this, or perhaps never learned it, and they paid the ultimate price. Their empire collapsed. Their ideology was discredited. Their people suffered through a decade of chaos and poverty in the 1990s, all because the price of oil, which they thought would stay high forever, dropped to $10 a barrel. The men who made this happen, Ronald Reagan, William Casey, and the Saudi leadership under King Fahd, understood the power of financial warfare. They proved that you do not need to invade a country to destroy it. You do not need to drop bombs or launch missiles. You just need to control the thing it cannot live without. For the Soviet Union, that thing was oil. And when the oil money stopped, the superpower died. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a bankruptcy. And the weapon that delivered the final blow was drilled from the deserts of Saudi Arabia and priced in the markets of New York and London. It was a war fought with barrels, not bullets. And it was the most decisive victory of the 20th century.